even among people who should and do know better. I contend that this tomfoolery of labeling even almost white Negroes as black corrupts thought about the past, present, and future of our city. Newspapers have a special responsibility for this nonsense, for newspapers both mold and mirror public opinion. Washington is a better city in which to live today because the two major dailies no longer condone lynching, approve segregation in public accommodations, denounce intermarriage, oppose full representation of the last colony in the Senate and the House. The more favorable portrayal of the Negro is the result of many factors. One is evidence that if we Negroes are given equal opportunity, we can compete on equal terms with other Americans, not only in sports, the performing and plastic arts, but also in literature, education, the art of command in the armed services, medicine, and even in science. A few vignettes dramatize some of the changes in race relations that have led to the more favorable portrayal of Negroes by the two principal dailies. Some years ago, Sir Esme Howard, British ambassador to the United States, was to be made an honorary member of Phi Beta Kappa. Negro members of Phi Beta Kappa asked whether they would be received. Carter Glass, the last unreconstructed rebel from Virginia, replied that as far as they were concerned, there was no problem, but waiters at the Mayflower Hotel would not serve Negro guests. I believe in the rights of labor as much as anyone in this room, but I'm not inclined to believe the waiters have the right to determine who guests will be at an affair of this kind. During World War II, Raymond Lester Bureau, one-time president of the Foreign Policy Association, wanted to take me to lunch. He was staying at the Cosmos Club, then located on Jackson Place. Since we could not eat in the Cosmos Club at that time, we had, I think Monty mentioned the fact, perhaps Sterling did also, we had to go to the Union Station. During the war, there were so many diners that there was a velvet rope. The hostess saw me. Raymond gestured for 2 seats. There was a seat for 1. There were seats for 3. There were seats for 4, with no seats for 2. Until a friend of Raymond Buell's came in, and Raymond, in his stentorian voice, said, "Senator Smith, I want you to meet Dr. Logan." The velvet rope came down. An adamant anti-predictionist, I make no predictions about the shadow. But I recall that a month before the March on Washington, a Negro was elected a resident member of that same Cosmos Club. And I remind myself of the motto of the class of 1913 at Great Old M Street High School, Viam Reperiam on Freciam, I will find a way or make one.
Thank you very much. Pull the microphone, the other one for yourself. Thank you very much, Dr. Logan. We will now hear from May Miller, poet, playwright, an extraordinary human being.
Thank you. To begin with, I'm May Miller here. I'm May Miller whenever I write. But just for the sake of honoring my husband, I'm still May Miller Sullivan. Well, now let's go back. I can't be the historian that Dr. Logan is. I'm just going to reminisce in a way. A beautiful childhood, a lovely uncircled childhood. While my father was writing polemics and discussing race relations, we were racing up and down the hills from the campus and the reservoir. I think the Skerlocks will remember that. Herbert is here. He was probably a very young boy at the time, but Dorothea and Helen played dollhouse. And I remember Dorothea was my child. Helen belonged to Remy. I'm not sure to whom Polly belonged. I think Polly belonged to Polly. But it was such a beautiful childhood. At the foot of College Street, and College Street reached from the pumping house over to 6th Street. Our community as children really was composed of those two streets, 4th Street and College Street, and 6th. And from 6th Street came the old family of the Simmonses, Dr. Hugh Simmons that everybody knows so well. He put in so many years at Freedman's Hospital, and really to the service of the city. And then we come to the Pelhams, the Hilliers, and really 2 or 3 groups of cooks. There was William Cook, George Cook, who was secretary at Howard University, and then there was the John F. Cook family. Probably you have heard the name in connection with the early Board of Education and the 15th Street Presbyterian Church. And then there was the Charles Cook family. Charles Cook taught English at Howard University. One of the great shocks of childhood was that Charles Cook was swimming in Atlantic City and suffered an attack of cramps and died or was drowned there. And I believe still there exists the stained glass window dedicated to Charles Cook. Well, that was the crowd. We went over on 6th Street and we sat on the steps and told our stories. They came over to our house and sat on the steps. We listened to the frogs at the pond at the end of the street. And my father told us the story of the frogs and what they were saying, and we'd repeat after him. And everybody made his own little contribution. It was a beautiful childhood. Now you talk about segregation. Right on the top of the hill that slanted up from College Street, where the women's dormitories now are located, there was one old man named Dr. Clark. He was of the theological department. The other gentleman was an old Mr. Ewell. And Mr. Ewell had had a stroke sometime along the line. And my brother Newton sat on the steps one day, and he was tracing the face that he saw. And he was trying to become a Mr. Ewell. So he took his fingers and twisted his mouth as old man Ewell's mouth had been twisted. And my mother caught him in the act. And she asked him, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm being Mr. Ewell." And then she explained to him, and I guess to all of us, that you never make fun of an infirmity. And things like that made a deep impression. For instance, this morning when I had to get up sooner than usual, because I sit up late and I sleep late. But this morning I knew I had to be here, according to Betty Parry, at 11:30. And then I remembered what old Mrs. Lewis taught us in the 8th grade, and you remember it too, because Miss Lewis taught us quotations. We had to learn those. We recited them before the class began. And this was the one I told myself this morning. Thank God when you get up that you have something to do that must be done. Whether you like it or not, being forced to work and forced to do your best will breathe in you diligence, self-control, and 100 other virtues that the idle will never know. I haven't been able to trace that quotation, but I know we learned it, and I know I have never forgotten it. And I don't know when I was teaching English that I didn't have savoir enough to have done this with my students. I made them learn the soliloquies from Macbeth and Hamlet, but those simple little quotations that might have gone with them through life. I didn't have sense enough at the time to realize what they had done for my life. I was thinking, you see, this is the trouble with listening to a poet talk. Association of ideas just gallops like that. And I wonder sometimes, well, what am I missing? What is it I should have said? Because I skipped from that to this and on down. Well, let's go back to high school. For a time, I taught English. And my students were pretty good and pretty responsive. I was in Baltimore at the time. Didn't teach English too long before I went into speech and dramatics, and then I had fun. And I had fun because I had come under Gum Gregory and Locke at Howard University, and they had us on all the stages, including the one in the chapel and even the Howard Theater. I remember, what did we do at the Howard Theater? The Truth. And Herbert Marshall was in that play, and so was I. And I remember when I got ready to go off stage, I hit the wrong door. But I was supposed to have been a very cantankerous old lady, so they took it as part of the role, for which I was very thankful. Now, when it comes to early life, I had the good fortune of having had some association with what we consider now some of the heroes of our culture. First, I didn't like Dr. Du Bois because when he stayed at our home, Irene and I had to give him our bedroom. And probably that was one of the reasons when my father died and Dr. Du Bois wrote a damning first praise, faint praise, sort of a eulogy on him, I began to despise him. And I said, now wait a minute. This is a man's opinion. He has a right to that opinion. Only thing I know is he didn't really know my father. Well, anyhow, a man named Schuyler answered that criticism in the Pittsburgh Courier. And I will never forget the name of Philip Schuyler for that reason, because he did what no member of the family could have done. Let's go back to those people that we knew. Old man Langston, who was one of the first Negro representatives, correct me, Dr. Logan, if I'm wrong, from, was he one of the last? Oh, we haven't had one since?
I said one of the last, not the last.
Not the last, okay. One of the last representatives from Virginia built the house that we lived in. Now, we inherited the house more or less from the Langstons. Old man Langston had sons and one daughter. Her name was Annette, and she married a John P. Napier in Tennessee. And the bedroom that as a young girl I lived in had carved on the glass pane the initials of J.P. Napier and Annette Langston. And I'm sorry when they took the house that I didn't ask for that pane of glass. It would have been nice to have had it. Well, they were engaged at the time, apparently. They were married in that house. And then late after years, when Napier came here, come on, what was he? Was he recorder of deeds?
Registered the treasurer.
A register of the treasurer. I remember his name was on the dollar bills. Right. Okay. See, I have always good references. Well, anyhow, the Langstons, when Napier left and the Langstons sold the house, we were still very young. We moved over, my father bought the house, and we moved over on the corner. And there is a sad story about that house that lives with me. I felt when they tore that house down, oh, by the way, my father sold the house to Howard University because he said with 5 children, heavens knows how they would be scattered, what the in-laws would want done. He wanted Howard to have that property that had once belonged to them and that John M. Langston had bought and built that house on. Okay. Well, my father lived there for his lifetime. That was the understanding. When we left there, they turned it into the alumni house for a time. And then finally, as you know, it came down for a dormitory. Now, I would have no resentment at all if that dormitory had been named for John M. Langston, the Langston Dormitory. I would have had no qualms if even they'd called it the Napier. And wasn't Napier a trustee at Howard, too? Yes. See, if they had connected it, but they reached down in South Carolina and named it for a woman, Mary Bethune, when they built a dormitory there. If they had named it the Miller House, I would have been deeply proud. But no, it was Mary McLeod Bethune House. And I saw no reason to reach down there to South Carolina and snatch a name and dedicate a dormitory for that reason. Well, that's the way it is, and the dormitory is there. The Scarlock children will remember how we raced and ran those hills and the fun we had in that neighborhood. And as all the kids, we went to Mott School. I had started to say to you, and this is the reason one should have really definite notes, because I'm just reaching out and pulling back. I remember when Du Bois came, and we had to give up our bedroom for him. I remember when old Booker T. Washington, and he was getting very old at the time, visited the Langstons or the Napiers at the time. And we went over and met him. I remember, too, that one of the Merriweathers was married in that house to one of Booker T. Washington's sons. All right, you old Washingtonians, correct me. Am I right on that? Okay. Well, now, into that house came Braithwaite, who was a very dear friend of my father's. And Braithwaite had a little goatee. He was editor of the Boston Transcript Anthology. And he was very proud of the fact that he was a poet. And when he came to the door one day, and I answered the door, I was a very little girl. And he said, "Little girl, where's your father?" And I said, "Out in the garden." And he said, "Well, how do I get there?" I said, "You go down the steps and around." I said, "Before you go, Mr. Braithwaite, may I say you look just like Mr. William Shakespeare." He had this goatee. And ever after that, when he'd send copies of the anthology, he put on them to the little girl who said I looked like Mr. Shakespeare. Well, life was very, very beautiful at that period. And when I stopped to think of the high school, we were particularly gifted. Jessie Fawcett taught us French and tried to make us writers and talked of her French background and her love of the French. I don't think she thought we were particularly bright. I'm not sure that she even gave us those good guttural sounds that Molly Gibson gave you. Okay, Antheus Glenn, I'll always remember him for the Aeneid. How could one forget? And every time I quote a line in a poem from poetry, I say, hi, old Antheus Glenn. And his beautiful wife, who was a Daisy Bruce, was that right? Daisy Bruce taught us in a dancing class at 9th and T. And I remember coming home from dancing class. The boys used to practice the steps on the street, and I reported to my mother that they didn't behave like little gentlemen. They danced on the street. And those of us who took dancing lessons at the time learned the old Virginia reel, the minuet, and then later on we learned toe dancing. But I don't think it was Daisy Glenn who taught us toe dancing. But, and then at that time, Howard University had in the basement a music department. We took music. All young ladies were supposed to know music. I remember we got as far as the 4th grade, and we could hammer out those little memorized pieces. I was never a musician, never born to be a musician, but there was something about Canella Lanton. She was an old Bishop Lanton's daughter. Canella used to say they were from Mississippi. Am I right about that? I think Mississippi. Anyhow, Canella would say, not that, honey, not that. And Canella was so beautiful and so lovely and played so beautifully. I went home and at the dinner table, I was saying, not that, honey. And they said, where did you hear that? And I said, that's what Canella said, not that. But, and then I do remember how impressed I was. Canella Lanton walked around the reservoir when she should have been in the chapel at 12 o'clock with Rector, John Rector. And they had them stand up in chapel and chastise them for walking around the reservoir in the time of the chapel. And I thought, if I can ever get to Howard University and can stand up in the chapel and be properly chastised. How's my time going?
You're doing fine. You've got about 2 minutes.
I have 2 minutes. Okay, let me do honor to those people, and those teachers particularly, that greatly impressed me and who inculcated certain standards. For instance, Dr. Riggs, in that the Burt speech, she taught us reasoning. And then Angelina Grimke taught us love of poetry because she loved poetry. And Glenn, as I said, and then don't let me forget an old man named Neville Thomas. We called him Cat Thomas because he had a cat-like voice. But he taught us ancient history as I have never appreciated it since. It was just opening a new era, and he made it live for us. And so today, every now and then I have to sneak into a poem, whether it's acceptable or not, some reference to that ancient history, that old Cat Thomas. I stood on the steps of the Parthenon and I said, I'm here, Cat Thomas. I'm here. Now, I don't know how here I am in many other directions, but having come out of school very early because of some physical disability, one never brags about that because whatever it has stood me very well. I'm still here among you. I came out of school early and I turned back to one of my first loves, poetry. As long as I was in school, I could do drama because I had a platform. I had a beautiful platform. And had beautiful students in speech and dramatics, and we got along beautifully. We wrote plays together, we did pageants, we did all the ceremonies of the school. It was a perfectly beautiful thing. I wasn't sorry to stop teaching, but I was sorry to lose. Lights out, kids. Lights up, kids. We're going. Curtain up. Lights on. We're going on. And the kids responded like that, and they were beautiful. Well, after I came home, I had no longer stage. Shakespeare taught me, if you're going to do drama, you have to have a stage. And so, no stage, no drama. I turned back to poetry. And I will say this, it has been a very rewarding avenue. I love the poetry community, and it has broadened my vision in many ways, has reestablished that faith I had in mankind as a child. And that beautiful childhood I could wish upon every child now. And I look at the cartoons animated and all of the violence, and I hate it. I hate violence for the children. And I'm not selling books. I'm not even going to have control of them. But a little book that I have done for the children will be out soon, and I hope it will just reflect some of that beauty of childhood that I once experienced. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've had an extraordinary opportunity to hear the reminiscences of four such distinguished members of the Washington intellectual community. And I'd like to open up the discussion now to allow you in the audience to ask them questions that mayhaps have been stimulated by reason of the discussion this morning or in other areas, or if you will, share reminiscences with us, those of you who lived through the early years here growing up in a segregated Washington, D.C. The lights make it. Do we have any questions? Yes, sir.
I'd like to know from the panelists how they were able to deal with, or if they had to deal with the idea of identity while they were coming out in the earlier Washington. You seem to have a strong sense of worth and conviction now. But how did you hold on to that when you were growing up here, especially in this area?
The question was, did you have difficulty dealing with the issue of identity as you were growing up in Washington? All of the members of the panel seem to have a strong sense of conviction and self-worth at this time. But was that a problem in the early years? And if so, how did you deal with that? Dr. Brown, do you want to start?
No, I can't answer that. I don't know too much about the word identity. I never had any trouble with identity. I had a friend who told me he was from Pittsburgh, and he didn't know he was a Negro till he went to a Morehouse, and I asked him, didn't he have any looking glasses in his house? No, I've never had any problem with identity. I've been separate. I have stated that I never spoke to a white person except the little son of the drugstore man at 10th and R until I went to Williams, but I found that's inaccurate. I spoke to a couple of streetcar conductors and man selling tickets at Union Station, but I knew nothing about white people, but it didn't bother me. I just knew people, and I was blessed with a wonderful family, house of books, house of music, wonderful gang of guys in Froggy Bottom. I was the minister's son, and they protected me, but that wasn't exactly identity. No, I've never been bothered about identity. I don't understand too much of the present psychological terms anyway. See, I'm very old-fashioned. I belong to the Victorian period. I've never understood, alienation. They gave out one poem of mine alienation. I don't know about alienation. I wrote a poem called Old Limb, which I had an old man in the South talk about mob violence. They misquoted it, by the way, in the paper. But it wasn't alienation, it was anger, maybe. And so I'm taking too much time since I don't have any problem with it. No, I can be identified. I got the ticket.
Dr.
Social
Cobb?
Security identity right here.
I never had any problem with identity. I would generally find out what the requirements were for something I wanted to do and go ahead and get it. I never aspired to play on the second team anywhere. And we knew what the blocks were here. As I said, they did not affect anything important. The libraries were open. The museums were open. The art galleries were free. And so this business about the restaurants, well, that took a little time, but it saved us a great deal of money too. And the matter of the theaters, there came here once E.H. Southern and Julia Marlowe, famous Shakespearean actors. And Poli's was the theater on Pennsylvania Avenue where they were performing. And they were here for a long stay. And they began to give a series for high school children. And under no circumstances would the theater permit anybody from the colored schools to go. So 3 teachers, Mrs. Harriet Shad Butcher, Miss Jenny Wilder, she was Miss Jenny Taylor then, and Miss Teresa Connolly, went to see the actors in their hotel, and they were horrified. So they came to Dunbar and gave a performance, the first time I've ever seen real acting, on that bare stage. And he was white-haired and shorter than her. I thought the actor had to be tall. No. And he gave a few words about what they were going to do, and then went into a scene from King Lear. And on that bare stage, everything vanished away. Well, we might have missed something in that, but the Howard players were as good as anybody at the time when they were at their zenith with Montgomery Gregory coaching them. They had Bulldog Williams, who later took part of the Emperor Jones. As a matter of fact, the owner wanted him to have it. The manager wanted him to take it, but Bulldog wouldn't. Then they had Alston Burley, who was a magnificent Nicias in Thais, you remember?
Right, yes.
And or as a seductive queen was Stella Skeeter. Oh man!
Yes.
And well, you couldn't have got any better than that. So we were not deprived, except that I think everyone determined that all that foolishness we'd have to get out, and we realized early that the person who was doing the segregating, or rather having the prejudice, was doing himself more harm than he was us.
Dr. Logan, would you like to comment?
I think one reason why we octogenarians and septuagenarians cannot respond very effectively to this question about identity is because of the fact that when we were growing up, we didn't even know the word as it is applied today. We knew we were Negroes, of course. We were not ashamed of the fact. We were not unduly proud of the fact. In my opening statement, I made the remark that if we American Negroes are given equal opportunity, we can compete on equal terms with other Americans. And one reminiscence comes to my mind that is relevant. In addition to our wonderful teachers, and I had many of those who have already been mentioned, Major Arthur Brooks was Commandant of the High School Cadet Corps. Many of the graduates who received commissions at the Colored Officers Training Camp in Fort Des Moines had received commissions or served otherwise in the High School Cadet Corps in Washington, D.C. In my senior year, the year that President Wilson was first inaugurated, I was captain of Great Old Company 8, the lead company. We assembled somewhere south of here, and we were directed to march forward. On a knoll, there were seated cadets from the Culver Academy. We Negro cadets were naturally behind the white cadets. The Culver cadets, out of a sense of camaraderie, stood up when the white cadets came, started to sit down when they saw us. I decided I'd teach them a lesson. I barked out the command, platoon right front in the line. We snapped it off so beautifully that they got up and they acknowledged our competence. So that in that respect, I believe that we here in Washington had a training not only in the classroom, but in sports under Ed Henderson. Ed Henderson, some persons don't believe this, and Monty had his doubt about it on a previous occasion. We played the first game of soccer in Washington, D.C. So far as I know, there was no competition between Negro schools and white schools, so I cannot be categorical about it. In addition to that, Ed Henderson organized the first cross-country in Washington, D.C., up Meridian Hill and back.
Don't forget to tell them I won that race.
You didn't win it because you weren't in it. Well, what I'm saying briefly is that despite segregation, despite the shadow of the Capitol, we had such advantages that the question of identity really did not give us great concern.
Ms. Miller?
I believe that one of the most telling experiences I had that might be attributed to discrimination was in Baltimore. As I said in the beginning, that childhood was perfectly free from any signs of discrimination. We used to make fun of the old white presidents at Howard because I think we called old man Newman a broken down minister. We called Durkee the great white dictator, and we just had names for them. And I'm sure we were reflecting what we had heard our parents say. But as for the professors, they were all quite just one of us, and they would scold us as quickly as they'd scold anybody else or anybody else's children. I think in Baltimore, probably the two most telling experiences I had were these. The trams, as they call them in Baltimore frequently, weren't segregated. And when I first went there to teach, the streetcar was quite crowded, and a lady of the other persuasion sat beside me. And she kept looking and studying, and finally she said, "Do you know, I was wondering whether you would consider coming working for me." She said, "I really need somebody who's neat in appearance, and I imagine that you speak well, and I think that you could run my household for me." And she said, "Would you consider?" So I don't know what happened to me, but I grew up. And I said, "Yes." I said, "Do you think you would be prepared to pay me the salary that I'm now drawing as a teacher in the Frederick Douglass," it was called the Colored High School at that time, in the Colored High School? She looked. She said, "You're a teacher?" I said, "I think I am. She didn't say another word. Then my father was speaking at the YMCA on Druid Hill Avenue. And I was sitting in the audience, and an old woman bent over, had a little child with her, and I was certain it must have been her little grandson. And my father was speaking, and she shook the boy. She said, "Look at him, son. Look at him." Said, "He's the smartest man in Washington. He is the richest man in Washington, and he's the only black one in Washington society." When I came home that weekend, we were laughing at the table, and my father said, "You should have touched her," and simply said, "Wrong on all three counts."
Let me share with you a story that I think is reflective of the kind of self-discipline that made growing up in Washington, although it was a segregated experience, not one that caused any sense of an identity crisis, because all of the men and women who shared this educational experience, who shared the discipline of sports and drill, knew that they were doing their very best, and they were fully qualified and fully competent to compete if only they were given the opportunity. The last year of my father's life, he was giving a lecture at Temple University Law School in Philadelphia, and an angry young black student got up during the question and answer period and shouted at the top of his lungs, "How can you say the things that you're saying? Why, you're just a tool of the establishment." And my father looked at him, and very calmly, in a very soft voice, which he usually used when he really wanted to make a point, he said, "Young man, I am not a tool of the establishment. I am the establishment. Does anybody else have a question?" And that was the end of that discussion. And I think it reflects the kind of inner confidence that these men and women developed during their lives in Washington that was able to allow them then to move out into the greater society beyond the inner circle, as it was, in the shadow of the Capitol, and help other young people as they were coming along and share their experiences with the generations that came after them. Do we have other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
On this particular topic, that I understand that color was introduced as an item in the term identification. That's the part of that. And if color were introduced, then what was the effect of passing upon social identification?
The question.
Trying to clarify my question and how color was involved with it. I was curious to find out why the older generation didn't have that identity crisis that the younger generation seems to have, because that was going to be my follow-up question. If in fact they didn't have the identity crisis, which I suspect would have been the answer, why is it the case that the younger generation of blacks do have that identity crisis?
We really have,
Is it a color factor?
we really have two questions. There's a follow-up question with respect to the issue is if there was not an identity crisis for the older generation, what is your analysis of why for the younger generations of blacks in America today there has been and seems to continue to be an identity crisis? And the gentleman on this side, as part of that question, wanted to know what was the effect of the concept of passing in the early days growing up in Washington. Dr. Logan?
I can't answer the first question on the problem of passing. My recollection is that they were not many Negroes in Washington who attempted